The night is quiet over the Nile. The air hangs heavy with the scent of water and dust, and the slow murmur of the river sounds like breathing. The torches of Alexandria flicker in the distance, soft against the black horizon. Somewhere in the palace, two sisters lie awake, each wondering whether the other is already plotting her death. This is the story of Arsinoe and Cleopatra, two daughters of the same royal house and yet two enemies fated to pull Egypt apart. Let us drift back to that world now, into the marble corridors and gilded courts of the Ptolemies, the last Greek dynasty to rule Egypt. The Ptolemaic palace in Alexandria was not Egyptian in spirit, though its rulers called themselves pharaohs. It was a place of Greek marble, of painted ceilings, of scrolls and scholars and incense that smelled not of temples, but of imported spice. The dynasty had begun with Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, and for 3 centuries, his descendants had clung to power, marrying their own brothers and sisters to keep the bloodline pure. By the time Cleopatra and Arsinoe were born, this family tree had tangled into something both divine and dangerous. Their father was Ptolemy X Hum, a man known to history as Elites, the flute player king. He was a ruler more comfortable with music than with politics. He drank too much, spent too much, and sold what little remained of Egypt's pride to Rome in exchange for their protection. Cleopatra, his elder daughter, watched it all closely. Even as a child, she had eyes like still water, calm on the surface, deep and unreadable beneath. She was quick with languages, clever with people, and had the unusual gift of actually speaking Egyptian, something most of her Greek ancestors had never bothered to learn. Arsinoe was younger, softer in voice and slower to judge. She had the gentleness that Cleopatra lacked, and perhaps that is why she was loved by those who feared the elder sister's sharpness. When their father died, the kingdom was fragile. Cleopatra was 18, Arsinoe barely 14, and on the throne beside Cleopatra sat their little brother, Ptolemy XD, only 10 years old, but already a pawn in the games of men much older. The will of their father had decreed that Cleopatra and her brother should rule together, husband and wife in the Egyptian tradition. But marriage was only a word. The real power lay with those who surrounded the boy, his guardians, his generals, and the ambitious men of the court. Cleopatra began her rule alone, signing decrees with her name alone, dropping her brothers from official documents. She appeared on coins wearing the royal diadem without him. It was a quiet declaration Egypt was hers. That arrogance, or perhaps that confidence, stirred anger in Alexandria. The courtiers whispered, the priests frowned, and soon, Cleopatra's enemies found in young Ptolemy a convenient symbol. By the 2nd year of her reign, the city turned against her. Cleopatra fled. She left Alexandria with only a handful of loyal followers and moved eastward into the harsh lands near Syria. For a while, she was a queen without a throne. She waited there, listening, watching the movements of armies, hearing news of her brother's triumphs, and the loyalty Arsinoe was beginning to attract. Because now the younger sister, sweet, overlooked Arsinoe, was finding her own power. In Cleopatra's absence, Arsinoe became a symbol too. To some, she was the gentler alternative, to others, simply a tool to use against the older queen. But history rarely spares the gentle. It was in this uncertain moment that the great Julius Caesar came to Alexandria. He came not for Egypt, but for the ghost of another Roman war, the one between himself and Pompey. Pompey had fled to Egypt seeking refuge, only to be murdered on the beach by Ptolemy's advisors. When Caesar arrived, they presented him with Pompey's severed head as a gift. The old general's face was grey, his beard clotted with blood and sand. Caesar wept. It was not the gesture they had expected. And from that moment, the Roman general decided to involve himself in Egyptian affairs, not as a visitor, but as a judge. Cleopatra saw her chance. She returned to Alexandria in secret, slipping into the city wrapped in a rug, or so the story goes, and was carried into Caesar's private quarters. It is a tale often told with laughter, but beneath its charm was calculation. Caesar admired bravery. He respected cunning, and Cleopatra offered both. What passed between them that night no one truly knows. But by morning, she was restored beside her brother on the throne. Caesar's troops surrounding the palace, ensuring her safety. And somewhere in the palace shadows, Arsinoe watched. To Arsinoe, this was betrayal. Her sister had returned not as a queen of Egypt, but as the pet of a Roman general, the pride of their house, of the Ptolemies, who had once ruled from the deserts of Nubia to the borders of Syria, was now guarded by foreign soldiers. Arsinoe fled the palace, gathering those who still resented the Roman presence. The Egyptian army crowned her as their queen in opposition to Cleopatra. She became a symbol of resistance. Young, brave, and free of Rome's shadow, for a time it seemed she might even win. The war between the sisters was fought not just in halls, but in streets. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, became a battleground of torchlight and screams. Caesar's troops were few, his position precarious. Cleopatra's palace became a fortress surrounded by enemies. It is said that the Nile ran thick with blood that winter. The city's great library burned, whether by accident or by the chaos of war. No one could say, and through it all, Arsinoe, barely 16, stood on the walls, commanding troops, promising the people freedom. She wore a golden crown, light and too large for her head. History paints her as Nara V, but there must have been courage in her too. Eventually, fortune turned. Caesar's reinforcements arrived by sea. The tides of battle shifted. Arsinoe's generals were defeated, her supporters scattered. She was captured and brought before Caesar in chains. There, she might have been killed, but Caesar spared her. The gesture was strange, even to his allies. Perhaps he admired her youth. Perhaps he saw in her a chance to shame Cleopatra by showing mercy to the sister she most feared. So Arsinoe was sent away to Rome. For a while she lived there as a curiosity, a princess in exile. The Romans paraded her through the streets in Caesar's triumph, a spectacle meant to display his power and Egypt's submission. They say the crowd pitied her. When the young girl, still dressed in fragments of her royal costume, was led in chains, the people shouted not insults, but cries for mercy. And so, she was spared again, sent to live in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, where she could remain under guard, but unharmed. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's world was rising. Her alliance with Caesar grew into something more. She bore him a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar, and for a brief time, her power seemed unshakable. She ruled Egypt as no woman before her had ruled. She walked among her people speaking their tongue, presided over rituals, and filled the halls of Alexandria with gold once more. But fate has a habit of turning. When Caesar was murdered in Rome, the balance shifted again. Cleopatra found new allies, first in Mark Antony, then in the fragile promises of love and empire. And still, somewhere far away, Arsinoe lived. Years passed. Cleopatra became the living symbol of Egyptian power, draped in gold and prophecy. Antony called her the Queen of Kings, and together they dreamed of dividing the world. But the Romans whispered. They remembered that there was another queen, the sister who had once defied Caesar himself and lived. To them, Arsinoe was a threat. Even in exile, her name could rally Egypt's enemies. Cleopatra knew it, and though we cannot read her mind, history records what followed. She sent word to Rome. She asked for the death of her sister. At Ephesus, within the sacred temple, where murder was forbidden, soldiers arrived. They dragged Arsinoe from the steps of Artemis's altar and killed her there, in defiance of divine law. She was 21 years old. Her blood stained the marble where no blood was meant to fall. And somewhere across the sea, Cleopatra's power trembled, secure for the moment, but haunted by what it had cost. After that, silence. The years rolled forward. Cleopatra's story would end, as the world knows, in another act of defiance, a serpent's bite, a golden death beside her fallen lover. But long before her, another queen had died quietly, unremembered, her name washed away by the sea winds that curled around Ephesus. Arsinoe's tomb, they say, still stands, or what might be hers, a round monument, half buried in earth, its stones marked by time. No inscription remains. Only a whisper of a name, and the faint echo of a sister's jealousy carried on the wind. So now, as the night deepens over the Nile in memory, we can imagine them both, two sisters shaped by the same blood, drawn to the same throne, undone by the same ambition. In the soft silence of history, they are not enemies anymore. Only two young women, caught between empires, between love and fear, between what they wanted and what they were told they must become. The river still flows. The torches of Alexandria have long since gone dark, and all that remains is the slow, eternal murmur of the Nile, carrying their story down through centuries, past broken statues and fading papyrus, into the quieter forgotten dreams. When the Queen of Egypt died, the world did not stop. The Nile continued to rise and fall as it always had. The fishermen still cast their nets, and the priests in forgotten temples still whispered the old prayers to the fading gods. But something in the heart of Egypt had gone quiet. The last pharaoh was gone. The crown that had once passed through centuries of divine blood was now only a trinket kept in Rome. And though the Romans called it victory, what they had really taken was the breath of a civilization. Octavian, the man who would soon become Augustus Caesar, stood at the window of the royal palace in Alexandria and looked out over the city. The air smelled of sea salt and smoke. The harbor below was crowded with Roman ships, their red sails drooping in the stillness of morning. He had won. Yet, even in victory, there was unease. Cleopatra was dead, Antony was dead, Caesarion was dead. The rest was silence. They say Octavian wept when he saw her body, not out of love, but because she had robbed him of his triumph. He had wanted to parade her through Rome, crowned in chains, a trophy of his conquest. But Cleopatra had chosen her own end, and in that act, she had defeated him in a way he would never admit. The Romans took her treasures first: gold, ivory, lapis, scrolls of learning, statues of gods that had stood for 1,000 years. They catalogued them like accountants, one item at a time, until the palace was nothing but echoes. Then they turned their eyes on her children. Cleopatra's twins by Mark Antony, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were spared. They were too young to be dangerous, too young to be symbols. The third, little Ptolemy Philadelphus, was also taken. They were sent to Rome to be raised in the household of Octavia, the sister of the man their father had betrayed. Rome called it mercy. Egypt called it captivity. In Alexandria, life changed slowly, as though the city refused to wake from a long dream. The scholars still came to the library, or what remained of it. The merchants still bargained under the shadow of the lighthouse, the great pharaohs that had guided ships for centuries. But the language of the city shifted. The Greek of the Ptolemies faded beneath the Latin of the conquerors. The festivals that once honored Isis and Osiris grew fewer, quieter. The coins that had once borne Cleopatra's face now carried the image of Augustus. A whole world was being rewritten in silence. For the children of the queen, Rome was both prison and stage. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter who had inherited her mother's keen mind and calm eyes, grew up beneath marble ceilings far from the desert wind. The Romans adored her beauty, her grace, her exotic air. To them, she was a living curiosity, a memory of the queen they both hated and admired. Yet within her, Egypt still breathed. When she walked in the gardens of Rome, she would pause sometimes by the fountains, watching the water spill over stone, and imagine the Nile, vast, slow, eternal. As she grew older, Augustus sought to erase her lineage not with the sword, but with marriage. He gave her to King Juba of Numidia, another royal orphan taken and tamed by Rome. Together, they ruled Mauritania, a kingdom at the edge of the known world. There, Cleopatra Selene built her own city, Caesarea, and filled it with statues of Egyptian gods and Greek philosophers. It was her quiet rebellion, her way of keeping alive the memory of a mother who had died a queen. But Egypt itself, the true Egypt, was slipping away. Under Roman rule, the land was no longer a kingdom, but a province. The temples of the old gods decayed, their priests reduced to caretakers of ruins. Taxes rose, grain was shipped north to feed Roman bellies, and the voice of the Nile became a whisper beneath the weight of empire. Yet still, the people endured. The farmers planted. The boats sailed. The songs of harvest and flood continued as they always had. For Egypt had lived too long to die in a single generation. In the great city of Alexandria, the Romans built their own shrines and theaters. They repaired what the wars had broken and renamed what they could not understand. The great lighthouse still burned its flame, though fewer ships came to dock beneath it. Philosophers argued about fate and virtue in the colonnades where Ptolemy's astronomers had once mapped the stars. But beneath the noise of the Roman world, the old Egypt slept, patient as stone. Sometimes, a traveler would pass through the city and ask about the queen who had once ruled there. The locals would speak softly, half in pride, half in fear. They would say she was beautiful, clever, dangerous. Some said she was a goddess who returned to the stars. Others whispered she had cursed those who conquered her. In truth, Cleopatra became a legend the moment she chose her death, and legends have a way of outliving empires. In Mauritania, Cleopatra Selene ruled wisely. She built temples and palaces that shimmered in the desert sun. She minted coins bearing her own image, crowned with the crescent moon. And though her kingdom was small compared to her mother's, it carried something greater. The idea that Egypt's spirit could not be conquered, only transformed. But even legends fade after her death. Mauritania too fell into Rome's grasp. The line of the Ptolemies, the blood of Alexander's general, vanished into the crowd of Roman nobility, until it was nothing more than a name on a scroll. Back in Egypt, the centuries turned. Emperors came and went. The temples to Augustus crumbled. Christianity crept into the land, and the old gods slipped quietly into myth. The face of Isis, once carved in stone, became the face of Mary in new churches rising beside the ruins of older ones. The people did not notice the moment the past became the past. It happened slowly, like the turning of the river's tide. Yet the Nile remembers. Every flood, every receding wave, carries silt that has known 1,000 years of kings and queens. Sometimes the water uncovers fragments, a shard of gold, a statue's hand, a bit of glass from a royal chamber, small pieces of a story too large to hold. The Romans could conquer the land, but they could not erase its memory. And so, when we speak of Cleopatra today, it is not the Rome of Augustus we remember. It is the Egypt that lived beneath her feet. The hum of the river, the flicker of oil lamps in marble halls, the sound of sandals against stone floors. We remember her not as a conqueror or seductress, but as the last dream of an ancient world that refused to surrender quietly. If you could stand now in the ruins of Alexandria, you would see little of her city left. The palace is gone, swallowed by the sea. The lighthouse has fallen. The great library is dust. But if you listen closely when the wind moves through the harbor, you might still hear a whisper, the murmur of a woman's voice carried across centuries. It says nothing of glory or war. It speaks instead of love, of choice, of silence. Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. It lived on in the whispers of her daughter, in the dreams of those who built after her, in the tales carried by sailors who still swore that her ghost watched over the Nile. And in that way, she became what the pharaohs always sought to be, eternal. The Romans would call her dangerous, vain, manipulative. The poets would call her beautiful. The priests would call her cursed. But the truth, somewhere between them all, is quieter. She was a woman born into the end of a world, trying to hold onto its meaning as it slipped through her hands. And when she could hold no more, she let it go with grace. As centuries passed, her tomb was lost, her body never found. Some say it lies beneath the waves, others in the sands beyond Alexandria. Perhaps it is better that way. Queens do not belong to graves. They belong to memory. And memory, like the Nile, never stops flowing. At night, the river still glows faintly in the moonlight, silver over black water. The reeds bend and sway. Somewhere, an ibis cries out, and the echo travels far, as if calling to ghosts. In that sound, you can almost hear her again. Cleopatra, the last of the pharaohs, the first of the legends, speaking softly to the world she left behind. And if you listen long enough, the line between past and present blurs. The marble halls rise again in the mind's eye, the torches flicker, the perfume of lotus fills the air. The queen stands at her balcony, looking out over the sleeping city. Below her, the Nile winds like a serpent of silver through the darkness. She does not turn to look at the Romans who march beyond the walls. She does not fear them anymore. She only watches the river, eternal and patient, carrying her story onward, past the ruins, past the sand, past time itself. The last queen of Egypt fades into the night, her voice quiet, her eyes still open, and the world, ever restless, moves on. The sands of Egypt had begun to settle. The wars, the parades, the cries of soldiers in the streets of Alexandria, all of it had faded into memory. In their place came a stillness that felt almost sacred. The sea whispered against the marble docks, the gulls circled the harbor, and the city of scholars, queens, and conquerors stood like an aging monument, unsure whether to mourn or simply endure. The Romans now ruled openly. Their standards flew from the palace roofs, where once the golden sun disk of Ra had shone. The Nile's waters carried their boats, their taxes, and their language. But Egypt, older than any empire that claimed to possess it, seemed to watch them with quiet amusement. It had seen countless rulers rise and fall. Rome, too, would pass. Only the river remained immortal. When Octavian returned to Rome, he took more than treasure with him. He carried symbols, Cleopatra's crown, her scepter, her legacy, all paraded through the streets as proof of his divine destiny. The people cheered, not for her fall, but for his triumph. They called him Augustus now, the exalted one. Statues were raised in his image, temples dedicated to his name. Yet even in victory, the shadow of Egypt lingered behind him like a half-remembered dream. The senators whispered that he looked older than his years, that the sands of the East had marked him somehow. He rarely spoke of her, though her death had given him the empire he craved. Meanwhile, in distant Rome, 3 children walked beneath cypress trees in the gardens of Octavia's villa. They were the remnants of a dynasty: Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios, and the youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, the last of the bloodline of the Ptolemies, the descendants of Alexander the Great. They did not speak of Egypt often. It was too far, too bright, too full of ghosts. Yet sometimes, when the wind carried the scent of the sea, or when Selene saw the moon rise over the Tiber, she would remember the palace halls of Alexandria, the shimmer of torchlight on polished stone, the soft voice of her mother speaking of gods and destiny. Rome was a world of marble and discipline. Egypt had been a world of dreams. Octavia treated them kindly, as Roman decency required. They were dressed in fine clothes, taught Latin and Greek, and instructed in philosophy, history, and the arts of diplomacy. But the Romans watched them closely, never allowing the children of Cleopatra to forget that they were guests, not heirs. The twins grew apart as they grew older. Alexander Helios was restless, fascinated by the stories of his father Antony's bravery. He longed for the open world, for battles and command. Selene was quiet, observant, and brilliant. Her tutors admired her quick mind, her grace, her restraint. She understood too well that their safety depended on silence. Time moved like a slow tide. The news from Egypt grew infrequent. The temples to Isis and Osiris were still maintained, though under Roman eyes they were treated as curiosities rather than holy places. The priests performed their rituals, but fewer believers came. The Ptolemaic palaces fell into disrepair, their mosaics chipped, their gardens overgrown. The great library, already wounded by war, suffered its final neglect. The scrolls that once held the knowledge of the ancient world faded into dust. A few scholars kept the old ways alive, copying fragments onto new parchment. But the age of discovery was over. The light that once burned in Alexandria had dimmed to an ember. Years passed before Augustus arranged the marriage that would shape the rest of Selene's life. She was to wed Juba Tewi of Mauritania, a man like herself, a royal child taken by Rome, educated in its ways, molded into obedience. He was intelligent, loyal, and mild-mannered, the kind of king who would never challenge the empire. To Augustus, it was a fitting match, two orphans of conquest, united under Rome's benevolent gaze. For Selene, it was a new beginning, though one built on exile. The ceremony was grand, filled with senators and dignitaries. Statues of gods watched silently as the young queen, wearing a crown of gold shaped like the crescent moon, swore her vows. Her face was calm, but her thoughts were far away, on the river, the temples, the mother she would never see again. Mauritania lay at the edge of the known world, where the desert met the sea. It was a harsh land, beautiful in its austerity. Here, Selene and Juba built their city Caesarea. It rose from the coastline in marble and sandstone, with wide streets, markets, and palaces that blended Roman precision with Egyptian memory. At its heart stood a grand temple dedicated to Isis, its columns carved with symbols of both worlds, the eagle of Rome beside the Ankh of Egypt. The people of Mauritania called her the Moon Queen, and in her gaze they saw both majesty and melancholy. She ruled wisely, encouraging trade, learning, and art. Juba was her partner in all things. But even he knew that a part of her always belonged to the Nile. Each night, when the sky darkened and the stars emerged, Selene would walk alone along the terraces overlooking the sea. She would watch the waves, hearing in their rhythm the pulse of another water, older and deeper. The wind carried whispers of languages long dead. Sometimes, she imagined she could hear her mother's voice, soft, distant, reminding her that even the conquered can endure if they remember who they are. In these moments, Selene did not feel like an exile. She felt eternal, like the moon whose name she bore. Back in Egypt, the centuries continued to turn beneath Rome's rule. The temples of the gods remained open but hollow, their priests more caretakers than believers. The Romans, fascinated by Egyptian mysticism, began adopting its symbols into their own religion. Isis became a goddess of Rome as much as of the Nile. Statues of her were raised in cities far from Alexandria. Her worship crossed borders, changing form with every language that spoke her name. The empire, vast and hungry, consumed even the sacred. And yet, through that absorption, something of Egypt survived. The people of the Nile adapted as they always had. Farmers tilled the same soil their ancestors had. The floods came and receded with divine regularity. Life moved in cycles. They spoke Latin now and Greek, but the old songs persisted in whispers. The faces of emperors appeared on their coins, but in their hearts they still honored the hidden gods of the river. History, for them, was not something to be studied, it was something to be lived quietly, season after season. In Rome, Augustus aged into legend. He became the image of eternal order, the bringer of peace, the master of a world that stretched from the pillars of Hercules to the sands of Arabia. But even as his empire flourished, time's shadow grew behind him. The men who followed would be emperors, not visionaries. Rome, for all its glory, would one day face the same decline as every empire before it. The Nile would watch patiently, as it always had. Selene's reign in Mauritania endured for decades. Under her guidance, the kingdom prospered. Traders came from distant lands, bringing spices, glass, papyrus, and scrolls. Artists painted her as a goddess, seated beside Juba beneath the moon's pale light. She encouraged learning, built libraries, and commissioned astronomers to map the heavens. Yet within her chambers she kept a small shrine, a golden scarab, a faded papyrus, and a lock of her mother's hair sealed in crystal. The world had moved on, but she refused to let memory die. When she finally passed, her people mourned her as both queen and symbol. Legends claimed that on the night of her death, the moon shone brighter than it had in living memory, casting the desert in silver light. Some said they saw the shadow of a woman walking along the shore, her robes trailing like waves behind her. Whether it was myth or miracle, none could say. But the story spread, carried by sailors across the Mediterranean, back to the land where her mother had once ruled. In Egypt, a few old priests, hearing the tale, bowed their heads and whispered her name in the ancient tongue, as though welcoming her home. And so, the daughters of Egypt's last dynasty faded into history, one by one. The empire that had conquered them would itself crumble centuries later. The temples would fall silent. The statues of emperors would crack and sink into the sand. But beneath the earth, beneath the layers of conquest and decay, the old stones would remain. The hieroglyphs, the tombs, the voices carved in granite, waiting to be rediscovered. Many centuries after Selene's death, travelers and scholars came again to the land of the Nile. They dug into the soil and uncovered fragments, coins bearing her name, shards of pottery from her city, faint traces of color on temple walls. Each discovery was like a whisper from a buried world. Cleopatra, Arsinoe, Selene, they lived again in the minds of those who sought them. The river, eternal witness to it all, flowed unchanged. It had seen gods, queens, empires, and invaders, yet it never forgot the faces that once gazed upon its waters. Now, as the modern traveler stands among the ruins of Alexandria or walks the quiet corridors of museums, where fragments of that age rest under glass, there is a certain stillness, a sense that time is not gone, merely sleeping. The golden masks, the papyrus scrolls, the tiny amulets shaped like eyes and serpents, all speak in silence. They remind us that history is not truly dead, it is only waiting to be remembered. In the end, Egypt's greatest legacy was not its kings or its battles, but its endurance. Empires fall, languages vanish, names fade, but the spirit that once built pyramids and dreamed of immortality still stirs in the sand and the water. The story of Cleopatra and Arsinoe, of Selene and all who followed, is the story of that endurance, the refusal of beauty and intellect to bow completely to power. The Romans thought they had ended a dynasty. In truth, they had only turned it into legend. When the night deepens over the Nile and the moon reflects on its surface like a coin of silver, the air seems to hum with memory. Somewhere in that stillness, if you listen long enough, you can almost hear her voice. The queen who chose her death, the daughter who built her own kingdom, the sister who fought and fell. They are all part of the same current, flowing together through the centuries, whispering to the listener that nothing truly ends. The river moves on, the world sleeps, and history, patient and eternal, dreams beneath the sand. After Cleopatra's death, the sands of Egypt seemed to shift once more. The Nile still flowed, steady and eternal, but the heartbeat of the kingdom had changed. Where once a queen had ruled with a crown of gold and serpents, there were now Roman banners fluttering above marble gates. The soldiers of Octavian, soon to be Augustus, watched over Alexandria with the detached precision of men sent to guard a place they did not love. Alexandria had been many things: a beacon, a harbor, a city of glass and parchment. Founded by Alexander the Great more than 3 centuries before, it had been built for the living, breathing union of Greece and Egypt. The streets had been planned in perfect lines, the palaces laid upon the sea's edge, and the library, the most magnificent repository of learning ever created, had stood as its soul. But by the time Rome ruled, the library was no longer the place it once was. There were still scholars, yes. There were still men who copied scrolls by lamplight, still whispers of ancient philosophies echoing in the courtyards. Yet the city no longer woke to the hum of learning. It stirred instead to the clatter of coins and the tramp of Roman sandals. The old scholars of the museum had either died, fled, or grown quiet under the shadow of new power. The Romans were practical people. They admired Egyptian grain, not Egyptian wisdom. What they needed from the Nile was bread for their empire, not enlightenment for their souls. Alexandria became their port of plenty, the place from which fleets carried wheat to feed the millions in Rome. Still, there remained a handful of dreamers. In dim chambers behind temple walls, they clung to the belief that knowledge had a kind of immortality. They spoke of Aristotle and Euclid, of Eratosthenes, who had once measured the Earth's circumference by the shadow of a stick. They remembered Hypatia's father, Theon, who had studied the stars. They spoke softly, for the times were no longer kind to curiosity. No one knows precisely when the Library of Alexandria died. There was no single night of fire that erased it all. It was not one act, but a slow forgetting. The first great damage had come long before, when Julius Caesar fought in the harbor during Cleopatra's rise to power. The ships had burned, and the flames had leapt to the docks, then to the storehouses, and finally to the libraries near the shore. Some said 40,000 scrolls were lost that night. Others said hundreds of thousands. Yet even after that fire, the scholars rebuilt what they could. The dream persisted. It was later, under Roman rule, that the deeper decay began. The world had changed. Greece's philosophers were dead, their scrolls copied into Latin, their ideas made comfortable for Roman tastes. The Egyptian priests who once guarded their temples now served under Roman priests of foreign gods. And yet the library, what remained of it, lingered on. There was another library too, the Serapeum. Built near the great temple of Serapis, it was both a shrine and a sanctuary of books. In that place, sacred rituals and intellectual debates lived side by side. The Serapeum had long been a symbol, a marriage between the divine and the rational, between Egypt's mysticism and Greece's reason. But symbols in Rome's new world were fragile things. In the centuries after Cleopatra, religion began to shift once again. Rome grew older, more restless, and as the empire stretched itself thin, something new spread through its veins, a quiet faith from Judea, Christianity. At first it was only whispers, gatherings in secret, prayers spoken in catacombs. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, it had become a force Rome could not ignore, and when emperors themselves took the cross, the old gods trembled. To many early Christians, the temples of the old world were not centers of wisdom, but of idolatry. They saw in the Serapeum not a sanctuary of learning, but a house of false gods. The scrolls stored there, the philosophers who spoke of reason, these were remnants of a pagan past. And so, when the time came, the Serapeum fell. It happened in the late 4th century, under the reign of Theodosius I. The emperor had ordered the destruction of pagan temples. In Alexandria, the Christian bishop Theophilus led a mob to carry it out. The priests of Serapis tried to defend their sanctuary, but they were outnumbered. The temple was stormed, its statues broken, its altars overturned. The scrolls, the last of the great collections, were trampled, scattered, or burned. No one recorded exactly how many books were lost, or which ones. But the silence that followed was louder than any fire. The old scholars, those few who had still clung to the belief that Alexandria was a beacon of knowledge, fled or faded into obscurity. The great line of thinkers, from Euclid to Ptolemy, ended there, not in smoke, but in exhaustion. By the 5th century, Alexandria was no longer a city of reason, but a city of faith. Yet faith has its own scholars, its own hunger for understanding. And so, new schools rose. Christian academies built where pagan ones had once stood. But the new learning was different. It was not about questioning the heavens, but interpreting them. The stars were no longer tools for discovery, but proof of divine order. The earth was no longer to be measured, but to be believed in. There was one woman, however, who tried to keep the old spirit alive. Her name was Hypatia. She lived in the early 5th century, a philosopher and mathematician, daughter of Theon. She taught in Alexandria, speaking in public halls about geometry, astronomy, and the nature of truth. Her students came from across the empire, drawn to her clarity of mind and her calm devotion to knowledge. In a city now divided by faith, she represented something that once defined Alexandria: reason, dialogue, curiosity. But that was no longer the world Alexandria wanted. In 415 CE, Hypatia was murdered by a Christian mob. They dragged her from her chariot and killed her in the streets. Some said it was politics, others said it was fear. Whatever the reason, her death marked the end. The last light of the ancient world flickered and went out. When night falls over Alexandria now, the sea still glimmers faintly against the shore. Beneath the modern city lie layers upon layers of forgotten stone, the ruins of palaces, temples, and perhaps somewhere, a trace of the library. Archaeologists have found bits of scrolls, pieces of parchment, and charred remnants of what might have been shelves. But the Great Hall itself, the one said to hold 500,000 books, has vanished as if it were a dream. And yet, in a way, the Library of Alexandria never truly died. Its spirit lived on in every place that valued learning. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, in the scholars of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, in the translations that carried Greek philosophy into Arabic and Latin, and finally into the modern world. The questions that once echoed through Alexandria's halls, about stars and numbers and the soul, still echo now, though in different tongues. It is said that when a civilization forgets, it must someday remember. Alexandria's loss reminds us of how fragile knowledge can be, and how eternal the desire for understanding remains. Imagine standing at the harbor, where ships once carried scrolls from distant lands. The waves are gentle now, the wind soft against the stone. The city is quieter, smaller, older. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it: the murmur of scholars reading aloud, the scratching of pens on papyrus, the hum of ideas drifting through marble corridors. That sound is the ghost of Alexandria, the whisper of a world that once believed wisdom could conquer time. And though the library is gone, its dream still lingers in every human mind that looks up at the stars and wonders.